The hero shooter genre has never had more high-tier competition, and I couldn't be happier. For years and years, Overwatch was able to sit complacent, lazy atop its throne with a graveyard of failed hero shooters at its feet. But no more. Apex, Valorant, Deadlock, and Marvel Rivals flank Overwatch from all sides, all giving their own unique take on the hero shooter genre. Some are more of a Twitch shooter, with faster movement and time to kill, and some are more MOBA, with more complex strategy mechanics and extended team fights. The other options are very clear in what gameplay they're trying to offer. Despite being the inspiration to several of these games, Overwatch struggles with its own identity. And I say it's about time that the developers pick a lane. Overwatch awkwardly stands in the middle of all of them, uniquely suffering from both an identity crisis and a public relations crisis. Both of which I think are solved if they just revert the clock back and set the base format back to 6v6 open queue and drop the 2. It's high time that they make Overwatch, the free-to-play version, the actual sequel to Overwatch 1. The recent dev update informs us that 6v6 Open Queue had a third of all gameplay until the wacky April Fool's mode came out, and at least currently 5v5 role queue is 3 times as popular as 6v6 open. However, I think the marketing of this mode is low, contained to the current Overwatch player base already, and it's not really sanctioned as the main mode yet, seeing as it's just replaced open queue, which everyone sort of assumes is the side act, not the main event for the game. Many players might not even know why it's such a big deal to begin with. In the 5v5 6v6 debates over the years, the overwhelming majority was the silent majority that kind of didn't care either way. Based on the stats, it looks like they're defaulting still to role queue, but I think for the long-term trajectory of the game, it's important that Blizzard picks an identity, seeing as these are so different from one another, and each mode competes with a different type of hero shooter competitor. Having multiple formats sends mixed messages to the players, and I'd have to imagine makes the game harder to develop for. Likely, one version will be getting preferential treatment, or will at least either be considered by the dev team themselves or the player base as the real competitive format. There isn't really a top tier game out there that has competing formats. I do believe one should be the default, the focus, the draw. And rather than commit to 5v5, which is a more reliable, balanced, easier to pick up, digest, and have a reliable experience game mode, I think instead they should commit to the unique and powerful experiences of 6v6 open queue, which does have lower lows, less consistent gameplay, but much higher highs. A much higher strategy expression, much more opportunities for skill expression and big payoffs, even if there's the downside of getting destroyed, demolished, counterpicked, countercomped way more severely than 5v5. We don't play video games for a reliable, sensible, reproducible experience. We play them for fun. And when you add in the fact that they're adding Stadium, which is even one more degree casual, how many formats and playlists are they really going to be able to populate? This is a big problem because especially when you think about lower population regions, they don't have enough players to go around. And I think a big percentage of the 5v5 players would warm up to 6v6, or the Venn diagram of the people that don't really care either way in the middle would more happily experience the benefits of role flexibility, instant queue times, a more punishing game, yes, but also a more deeply compelling one. I think it's a bad idea to intentionally split up the long-term trajectory of this game. I also think it's obviously going to hurt matchmaking, even if it isn't hurting now. But I think the biggest, strongest argument I have for this isn't about appeasing the current player base we have, because after playing a few years of 5v5, a lot of those players are going to be used to that, yes, but there's 2 player pools that I think we can appeal to even better with a 6v6 revert. The old Overwatch 1 players that left the game. A 6v6 open queue revert would be an apology for the terrible decisions going from Overwatch 1 to 2. It would give them the opportunity to remove the 2, relaunch the game, like so many of us have been saying in podcasts and feedback and video essays for years now, because when you read feedback on the Steam reviews, the forums, or really anywhere on the internet, a huge percentage of the complaints that are levied are perception-based. not even based in reality. Gamers on the whole hate Overwatch for mistakes that it made years ago. And it could be any number of things. Paywalling heroes, for example, no longer a thing. Harsh prices on cosmetics. They've really improved that yet again in the sequel, just like they did in the first game. But the overarching impact of everything always will be fun factor. And the things that drove away the video game donkeys of the world and that mainstream player was the freedom of expression in the game. Role queue was seen by many as a limiting force, placing in a try-hard, sweaty component to what otherwise would be a very casually appealing game. Which, by the way, as we've seen with the Marvel Rivals player base, while there are some murmurs and cries for role queue there, on the whole, most players don't want it. Because the upsides of the speed of matchmaking and the flexibility across the cast in your given game is a much bigger upgrade than reliably having a set composition on your team every single game, which, by the way, for many, and often in some cases, is a straight up downside. For those longtime fans, what you will know is ahead of role queue, what I actually wanted was hero bans. A system that is so well liked in Marvel Rivals that it's expanding to the gold ranks. So an even higher percentage of players experience the ban system, allowing them a say to thin out the things that annoy them in the game and curate their experience without expecting the dev team to solve their pain points. I'm making a lot of comparisons to Marvel Rivals, and the reason is because I think what Blizzard needs to do with Overwatch is get away from competing with more of the traditional FPS style games, Apex and Valorant, because I don't think we'll ever actually court those types of players long term anyway, no matter how shooter focused the game becomes, due to the strength of synergies and ultimates just existing in any of the formats. That's why I think the game should lean into what it actually is, what it always has been, an over-the-top, bombastic, punishing shooter game, yes, but hero shooter game with an emphasis on strategy. Because for Jeff Kaplan's sake, why the hell should NetEase make more of an Overwatch 1 sequel than Blizzard has? No, that's dumb. Pick a lane. Sequel to Overwatch 1, make that. Because 6v6 open queue with perks and the future additions like Stadium, now we're cooking with a sequel. Just in time to relaunch it as Removing the 2. Put fun back into the game, and Blizzard, please drop the 2. Especially as I've seen Blizzard bend over backwards to every sub-community of player to try to balance the game to perfection, yet they still get constant complaints about design issues from our lifelong, overly developed community that because they've played one game for a decade, they think they've gone to design school and see every bit of gameplay that they don't like as somehow a fundamental flaw in the format or balance or design philosophy or any of this. Meanwhile, Marvel Rivals is over there and it's completely bullshit, okay? Like, that game is bullshit and it's very fun. 6v6 Overwatch open queue is also bullshit. Lots and lots of bullshit. Lots of easy ways to win, lots of losing at the hero select screen, but none of this matters because the most important thing was in the 5v5 tryhard format, players found it less fun. And then on top of that, there was the big Bobby Kotick PvE rug pull situation where they didn't tell us that they weren't actually going to be releasing the actual PvE that they had shown us and talked about and dropped the development of the game for years, released Overwatch 2 without it. Then, so much later, after we all bought skins and the Watchpoint pack and everything else, oops, sorry, the PvE actually sucks, guys. Here's the trash missions that we actually salvaged. It's so bad that we're going to cancel the whole thing. We, as dedicated players in the Overwatch community, don't talk about this moment enough because the mainstream gamer player base felt the blow of business malpractice that we haven't seen since No Man's Sky. And just like that game, Blizzard needs a signal that they're getting back to the things everybody liked. And regardless of what the current player base is or isn't playing, the grander, larger, old school and new school player base is going to respond to Blizzard doing a rebrand, relaunch, redefining the sequel to be not a sequel. Boy, wasn't that a dumb idea, the redefine the sequel? Let's just drop the 2. Hashtag drop the 2. Doing that, bringing 6v6 open queue back, and putting a post in the ground that this is a game about fun and expression. 6v6 Open will be the competitive format, and Stadium is the wacky format that you do absolutely crazy things. Come one, come all. That is the type of game that I know can compete up against Marvel rivals. It isn't going to court the audience that wants fundamental shooter gameplay like the jiggle peeking of Valorant, or that familiar, responsive, snappy gun controls of Respawn Entertainment's Apex. We're not getting those players. There's too many competitors in the space and the marketplace for Blizzard to play its normal wide net game where they're trying to appease every single type of player at the same time. We no longer have that player base. No game has that player base. At least not one as hardcore as this one. I think there's a lot of very good devil's advocacy points and arguments that can be made for 5v5. I made them. I'm right there next to Avril, actually pulling up the stats, looking at the performance, getting over the cognitive biases, and looking at the reality on the ground as opposed to the perceived preferences based on survivorship bias. But none of that matters, because regardless of the truth, the public perception is that 5v5 was a failure along with Overwatch 2, and more importantly, less fun than 6v6. And because I've always been pro fun over balance, we need to go and drop the 2 and go to Open Queue 6v6 with bans, which is the best version of Overwatch, as it gives the player the freedom to express themselves. The variety of experience matters a lot more than I think anyone realized when we felt that role queue was required so many years ago. In 5v5 role queue, if your tank is getting dumpstered by either their bad play or the enemy's counterpicking, your option to carry as support is to go get kills before they throw the game. I do find that kind of fun myself. However, it's very one-dimensional. In 6v6 Open Queue, I can literally tell my tank, swap roles with me, bud. I know how to play this. And several of my matches went from getting blown out to winning handily as I, a flex player who knows the engagement strategies and most importantly, macro team play, can carry in 6v6. While 5v5 has a lot more individual agency, you can always find a way to hit shots and land a kill, 6v6 has a lot more strategy and much bigger quote-unquote agency to the players that can contribute to the full team matchup. A player who fills Reinhardt might make their entire team immune to the enemy if they play well. A player who picks Juno or Lucio might give their team an insurmountable positioning advantage on the objective. Having one of your 6 players specialize in Widow might save your Havana map, or whatever niche counterpick you might need in any given match. Oddly enough, due to the lack of specialization in Open Queue, the player base who likely has learned at least a couple of off-role picks over the near 9 years the game has been out, now can flex around a lot more than they did in the early years of Overwatch 1. And this is something that I was really excited about, and I will say a small asterisk on this point because, again, we know from Alec that 3 times the players are still in role queue, so the players that are playing Open Queue are likely the subset of players that uniquely like the idea of flexing around and playing different roles and knowing they're not necessarily going to get to play their preferred role at any given time, or they might have to deal with bad team comps. So the culture of playing Open Queue in that smaller environment of players that actually want to be there was a lot better. And we might imagine that if it was merged together and we got everybody in there, that the culture of the game might actually drop. However, I think especially due to the very early good signs of 6v6 Open Queue, but also the culture of Marvel Rivals, who has a much bigger casual player base, I think the player base of hero shooters is ready for the added complexity and hero selection pressure that goes into performing well in these games. And this is something that I had to adjust my stance on, because this was much, much different back in the early years of Overwatch, okay? When players were coming from all manner of different games and the hero shooter was just being invented, knowing how to work together or flex on multiple roles, or even just knowing how to make a decent team comp wasn't necessarily mainstream knowledge in that mainstream player base that we did have. Overwatch 1 was one of the biggest games of all time, yet there wasn't any training wheels of other comparable games to get the player base ready for it. Whereas Marvel Rivals is off to the side, releasing like a spiritual successor or multiverse alternate reality sequel to Overwatch 1, and a lot of the Overwatch 1 players would have jumped on board, establishing a baseline expectation of how these games are played throughout the player base. Then on top of that, because of all the content creation and how much bigger and and uniform gaming is in general, players are just more invested in the types of games they play. This is very different from 2016 because back then the industry was flooded with repetitive military shooters. Every game wanted to be COD, Battlefield, or Counter-Strike, and there was many clones of them. But there was only one Overwatch. And for many of us in our hearts, there was only one Overwatch for several years, and lots of other knockoff games that failed. But there now, after years of time, have been enough games similar in the genre, or at least introducing the idea of hero mechanics, that's no longer a novel idea. Instead, it's more of a normal thing games try to do. In 2016, every shooter game wanted to be as easy to pick up and play and understand as Call of Duty. In 2025, Marvel Rivals sits atop the genre with ability spam that is more chaotic than League of Legends, breaking the assumption that players want simple visual clarity, which was a common critique of Overwatch 1 for several years. Not by its fans, of course, by games journalists, who are the types of players that we should not even be listening to on any of these subjects anyway. So not only are complex characters ubiquitous in multiplayer games, there's so many options now that there's no way for one game to unite them all under a wide umbrella. That's not really possible. The devs got a little bit shook, I think, from competitors like Fortnite that were more casual and pick up and play, or Valorant that were more competitive. So I think they ultimately tried to lean more that way rather than dancing with the one that brought them. Rather than compete up against a game you're not, I think Blizzard should make Overwatch lean into the unique strengths it already has, and 6v6 Open Queue does that the best. Let me just glaze Open Queue for a section now, okay? There's a lot of improvements to Overwatch 2 that make Open Queue play better now than it did so many years ago in Overwatch 1. Whether it's the global self-heal passive for all heroes, far better map design, and most of the heroes being added or reworked are very expressive with lots of options. No role feels entirely beholden to their team like it was in Overwatch 1, bar a few exceptions, like a few tanks don't hold up as well. But overall, because of the flexibility of Open Queue, you can bail out on any role that is frustrating you anyway. We were familiar with the freedom of comps of Overwatch 1 Open Queue, but now today, with so many of the roles fleshed out with lots of options, the probability that any given player can find a hero for them to fill on the team that suits their playstyle is just way more likely. Because maybe you only play one hero in any of the three roles, but your team needs it. The more options there are, the more likely you are to do that. At the launch of Overwatch 1, and ironically Overwatch 2, the support role wasn't very popular, but now in 2025, we have characters like Brig, Juno, Lifeweaver, Illari, Kiriko. In 2016, you could choose between Lucio, Mercy, or a 150 health Zen decoy option. In Rivals, there's kind of only 1.5 DPS-minded supports. Overwatch has several, or at least ones that are easy enough that you don't feel you have to master them entirely to contribute, and still give you some supporting. Usually the bottleneck is tank players, and way back when they were considering role queue, I had an interview with Scott Mercer, who he said to my face, "We don't want it to become the Reinhardt queue." Which ironically for the metal ranks, it actually did. Once they put role queue into the game, for about 70 to maybe even 80% of all players, the game kind of felt unplayable if you didn't have a Reinhardt. That's actually a huge problem for the game, and was an even bigger design problem in Overwatch 1 as they tried to find out ways to make an alternate main tank, but they never really did it. Mainly because they didn't want to repeat designs. So attempts at a new main tank looked like Orisa, the original version with a bunker shield, or Wrecking Ball, which was like a direct death ball counter. Whereas now in Overwatch 2, we have a character like Ramatra, who for all intents and purposes is just an updated Reinhardt anyway, who's more fluid, flexible, less team reliant. But a hard lesson that the devs had to learn is that they had to make reproducible kit and alternate options for the same role. They couldn't be too married to the idea of every hero that they ever invent be entirely unique. That was ridiculous. So now that we at least have some variability or overlap with characters that could be considered an engage or main tank style playstyle, 6v6 Open Queue plays a lot better, basically. For the balance of the game, the off tanks are utterly required. In fact, a lot of characters will double up as being the main tank as long as you have an off tank in the current balance state anyway. Like Zarya is way overtuned for 6v6. D.Va waits in the wings as being like the meta team version, but is more supportive, whereas Zarya counters a lot and as well as just an outrageously strong character against lots of things, especially in the perks meta. But that's something that's patch reliant right now. Could change, but I actually think that there's not so many of those off-tank style heroes because they, of course, design tanks to try to fit in 5v5, that they've got more of their own offense and shouts. Like, look at it. Hazard, Queen, the Roadhog rework, Mauga. Basically, none of the 5v5 design tanks fill that off-tank role, and it seems the most required, in my opinion, in the 6v6 meta we have currently in Overwatch 2, whereas I would have said it was the main tank in Overwatch 1. That's a bit of a surprising trajectory for me that I didn't anticipate, partially because the maps are so much more open. So you can get away with having a bad main tank pick, or bad quote unquote, as long as you have an off tank supporting them, then your tank line can function, kind of. Like Hog Zarya in 6v6, very playable. Hog Winston, instantly lose. And while yes, is there an incredibly punishing and oppressive nature to team comp synergy where you auto win or lose at the hero select screen? Yes. You know what I say to that? Good. Good. It's a strategy-based game. Why did we bend over backwards to try to make it accessible to every kind of one-trick player that wants to play their given hero and never lose because they want to pick Mercy no matter what, even if it's bad? No, you can go one-trick Symmetra and quick play. I think now, this time around, with this dev team who actually is going to put hero bans in and isn't afraid to step on the toes of any given one trick when there's, I don't know, almost 50 characters in the game at this point. You can't appease everybody. Not everything is going to be viable all of the time, and there's going to be much more oppressive synergies baked into the cast of the game. What else would we expect? I warned that this would be a problem, quote unquote, when defending 5v5, but ultimately, this is what makes me interested and good at the game. I have the potential to be a much more effective player and teammate knowing macro strategy, which is essentially not even a useful skill in 5v5 so much. Like, it only gets you so far. It's as simple as like, let's have Suzu for their anti. It's like not that deep, right? Whereas in 6v6, it's possible for one hero choice to shut off the entire enemy 6, based on creating some sort of swing play that has a ripple effect on the entire team matchup. Whereas 5v5, everyone is more self-sustainable and playing their own lane always. 6v6 has much more ebb and flow, which allows for a much more complex ult fight, emphasizing the strength of team comp building with the big payoffs of explosive team wipes, often one ult funneling the enemy into another. Now, probably to do their own due diligence, they're going to need to do a 6v6 role queue ranked playlist, and I think this is going to be a mistake. I think 5v5 is the superior version of role queue as it makes for the best queue times, but I quickly have learned how much I dislike role queue because the ability to swap off a role into another one that might have a hero that solves the equation of the matchup is so liberating that I don't want to be locked into my role just so I have 10 odd options when I could have 40. Also, I think undoubtedly, no matter what data they get early on based on matchmaking, at one point or another, one role will be more popular than the other due to a new hero, due to the balance state, or the perceived fun factor, and all of that changes based on your MMR already. This is not worth the benefits. Part of the reason why I advocated for 5v5 was because I assumed we had to have one of these two role queues, and I think 6v6 role queue would just be a failure, be worse than 5v5. The cultural issues of the game are much more improved by open queue, ironically enough. We might assume that there would be a travesty of 5 DPS picks, but at least in the ranked version, that's usually not the case nowadays because it's such a bad idea and there's so much good fun factor opportunity across all of the roles. You likely won't be doing that. And while it might be annoying to have your tank player rage swap to another DPS, in my experience, it actually improves the playability oftentimes, because perhaps one of your teammates notices that and swaps to tank to fill his position anyway, or your team just adapts to a new style of team comp, which might be even better for you regardless. Because in any case, a teammate feeling trapped in their position, not being able to contribute, them having the freedom to swap off that makes the game play a bit better. This conversation has been so interesting to follow over the years, and I think with the combined efforts of the greatest minds that Overwatch has to offer between the very intelligent dev team and the passionate player base that has analyzed every little detail about Overwatch over these years, we have fixed it. Open queue 6v6 is the answer. The team fight flow of the explosions is much more rewarding. You do get stomped more. You will get gate kept at the hero select screen, but that also will happen to you. Winning feels better, as when you get to, you decimate and dominate. The higher highs are worth the lower lows. It does open the door for a teammate lottery issue, but just like the game of poker, sometimes you get drawn a bad hand, but other times you're playing with a full house. And those big payoffs are what you chase in these types of games, not reliability and consistency. It has a lot more BS, but that's where hero bans come in, and hey, I hope that we can maybe begin the long conversation of looking towards a draft mode, which is what I've always actually wanted deep down, even after hero bans. We got hero bans, so now I get to push towards the draft mode I've always wanted. I don't know, maybe in 2030, we'll realize that that's an even better version of hero bans, but we'll get to that when we come to it. Guys, that's everything for me. I've been Frito, covering Overwatch and Marvel Rivals. I hope you did enjoy this video. I'm sorry for my long absence. I've been collecting my thoughts, gaining momentum, wanting to really put my best foot forward in content again, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave it a like, and don't forget to click subscribe and the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos come out. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your